Hello everyone! Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we explore the most recent and significant events that are shaping our world. Today we are talking about an event that has shaken Iran and had global repercussions, the popular uprising following the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022. This triggered a wave of nationwide protests and a violent response by the Iranian government, bringing the spotlight back to tensions around women's rights, individual freedom, and oppression in the Iranian regime. To understand the magnitude of these protests, we must first examine the context in which they occurred. Since the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iran has been under a theocratic regime ruled by the Ayatollah and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards. The country is known for having strict religious laws that regulate aspects of daily life, especially when it comes to women. One of these laws, which has been a source of controversy for decades, is the obligation for women to wear the hijab or Islamic veil in public. This law is part of a larger set of moral norms that controls women's appearance and behavior in Iranian society. On September 13, 2022, a young woman named Mahsa Amini, 22, originally from the Kurdish region of Iran, was arrested in Tehran by the Iranian morality police for allegedly not wearing the veil properly. According to the official version, Mahsa Amini violated the country's dress code, which led to her arrest. What happened next is a matter of great controversy. 3 days after her arrest, Mahsa Amini died in police custody. Authorities claimed that the young woman had suffered a heart attack, but her family and many witnesses claimed that Mahsa had been brutally beaten by the police, which would have caused a brain hemorrhage and eventually her death. His death sparked a wave of outrage across Iran and beyond. Mahsa Amini's name quickly became a symbol of resistance against the regime and its treatment of women. On September 17, 2022, at Mahsa Amini's funeral, the first protests erupted in her hometown of Sagez in Iran's Kurdish province. Women and men took to the streets to express their grief and anger over the young woman's death, defying the authorities' strict ban on public gatherings. What began as a demonstration of mourning and solidarity quickly transformed into a national movement. Protests spread across the country, reaching major cities such as Tehran, Isfahan, Shiraz, and Mashhad. Iranian women, in particular, played a prominent role in these protests, as the movement focused on women's rights and their struggle for freedom. In an unprecedented act of civil disobedience, thousands of women across Iran began removing their veils in public and cutting their hair in protest. These gestures, which in a country like Iran are seen as acts of direct defiance of authority, became a way of symbolizing the struggle against strict dress codes and, more broadly, against the oppression of the regime. As the protests grew, the Iranian regime responded with brutal repression. Security forces and Basij, paramilitary militias, were deployed across the country to quell the demonstrations. The use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and in many cases real firearms against protesters became commonplace. Multiple deaths, injuries, and thousands of arrests were reported over the days that followed. Despite the violent repression, the protests continued and the slogan "Woman, Life, Freedom," Persian, Zan Zendegi Azadi, resounded in the streets of Iran and in demonstrations of support around the world. This popular uprising in Iran was not only a protest against hijab laws, but also transformed into a revolt against the regime as a whole. Over the past few decades, dissatisfaction with the theocratic regime has been growing due to corruption, lack of political freedoms, economic mismanagement, and the country's international isolation. Protests expanded beyond women's rights to include demands for social justice, political freedom, and an end to repression by the regime. One of the highlights of this uprising was its intergenerational nature. Although young women were at the heart of the movement, there was also significant participation from men, the elderly, and other marginalized groups. This was especially noticeable in the most impoverished regions and in ethnic minority communities, such as the Kurds and Baluchis, who have long suffered oppression from the Iranian central government. To quell the protests, the Iranian government imposed severe restrictions on the internet and mobile communications, trying to limit the spread of images and news about the crackdown. Despite these efforts, however, images of the protests and brutal repression leaked abroad, drawing widespread international condemnation. Countries around the world, as well as human rights organizations, denounced the Iranian regime's excessive use of force and called for justice for Mahsa Amini and the victims of the crackdown. One of the most notable effects of this uprising was the international solidarity it generated. Demonstrations of support took place in cities around the world, from Paris to New York to Berlin, where women and men protested against repression in Iran and called for more international attention to human rights in the country. Social media also played a crucial role, as Mahsa Amini's name became a global symbol of resistance against oppression, and women around the world began to replicate the gesture of cutting their hair as a show of solidarity. However, Iran's regime showed no signs of giving in to the protesters' demands. Crackdown continued, and the government tried to portray the protests as a plot fomented by foreign powers to destabilize the country. Despite continued efforts to silence the protesters, the uprising was not in vain. Over the months following Mahsa Amini's death, pressure on the regime increased both internally and externally. Although the protests were largely suppressed, social unrest and demand for change persist in Iran, with many believing that this uprising has marked a point of no return in the struggle for women's rights and civil liberties in the country. Mahsa Amini's legacy and the 2022 uprising is yet to be determined, but her death has left an indelible mark on Iranian society and the human rights movement around the world. In a context where protests have historically been cracked down on, Iranian women's courage in publicly challenging the regime represents hope for the future. The struggle for freedom and dignity continues in Iran, and the world continues to watch closely what is happening. Thank you for joining us in this analysis of the uprising in Iran over the death of Mahsa Amini. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell for more revealing stories here in Untold History. See you in the next one.